Just give it another minute before we start. If the fan ends up being kind of annoying, I will turn it off. But it is kind of, well, it's one of those things is like, I don't want to say like, oh, it's hot, because I know someone will be like, oh, but it's not as hot as where I am. Da, 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 da. And like, considering where I live, it's not that hot in comparison. What are we at, like roughly 30 degrees Celsius? So what is that, like just barely breaking 90 degrees Fahrenheit? Whereas like, you got your places that have like triple digits, which I mean, honestly sounds like hell, and I'll never complain about heat or cold here where I live, because it's pretty great where I live. That's all I can say about that. But just let me know if the fan ends up being annoying. I can turn it off for the duration of the stream. I drank my tea too quickly. Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the Book of Acts. And today we are going to read chapters 25 and 26. We are nearing the end of Acts, as next week we will be finishing the Book of Acts. Then take a couple weeks break and then go into the Book of Romans. So that's kind of the plan, and then we'll see what happens after I read the Book of Romans, because honestly that was the only thing I had planned for the rest of this year. I don't know if I have any other Bible reading streams planned out after Romans, but Romans will take us a while, because I'm going to take that one a lot slower than I have been with the Book of, like, basically anything else we've been reading. But that's because the Book of Romans is just so rich with stuff to say and content, so we'll read Romans a lot slower, I think, is a good way of going about it. But anyway, today we're going to read chapters 25 and 26 of Acts. If you have a Bible, I encourage you to read along. It's always better to read it as well, so that I'm not just spewing. I could make stuff up and you would be none the wiser if you don't have your Bibles in front of you, but I always encourage you to have your Bibles. Of course, I will be using the New International Version with a slight streaming Parson abridged for some parts that, I tend to skip over or whatever, and just kind of give you TLDRs kind of thing. Before we begin, I'm going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Lord Jesus, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have to read into your word. And I pray that as we continue reading the book of Acts and as we near finishing it, I just pray that you would continue to show us what it means to be faithful to you, and perhaps the opportunity to not just learn your word as literature, which it is, but also knowing a way of knowing your desires for our life. I pray this in your holy name. Amen. All right, so just a quick recap of last week. So last week we read chapters 23 and 24. And we are basically nearing, well, we're obviously nearing the book of Acts, which by extension is nearing the end of Paul's little misadventures, as we have at the end of the book of Acts. And now he's kind of been held up in Caesarea. He's a prisoner there, quote unquote. But the funny thing is that, like, he's supposed to be under house arrest, but he's actually got it, like, pretty relaxed. We're like, oh yeah, you know, he can go out with an escort, of course, and his friends are still able to visit him and whatnot, and so he's got it pretty relaxed. That's why he's technically under, like, house arrest. Of course, the governors probably figured that, like, well, this is just some kind of Jewish religion thing, so there's no point in really treating Paul like a criminal. And of course, there's the whole Roman citizenship thing too, so they don't want to be too harsh with him. But I also do kind of find it funny that, like, when, like, some people might have this image of, like, man, Paul being a prisoner for Christ, it's super hard and super difficult, you know, as opposed to some experiences we read about today, where some Christians have it a lot worse than Paul does here. At least at this part. When Paul gets to Rome, it's a little bit different, but even then, Paul's prisoner situation isn't the same. And I don't want to equate the two, because that wouldn't be right. As opposed to, you know, many believers that face a lot of persecution today, and the prison conditions that they are put in are terrible compared to what Paul has. Paul has it pretty good, actually, as we read through the rest of Acts. And of course, if you read the epistles of Paul, which we will read Romans, when Paul talks about his prison experience, it's really not that bad. And so, I mean, it's just a blessing in Paul's life that in his old age, things are going pretty well for him. I mean, to be fair, we are like early 60s AD at this point, so near the end of Paul's timeline, as he spends a couple years in Rome and then he's beheaded in 67 AD. And so at this point, and I've talked about this in great length a couple weeks ago, so you can definitely check out the playlist when I finally make it, that Paul would have been a pretty old guy as well. So that's another reason why the Romans wouldn't have been harsh with Paul, even though they put him under house arrest, because he's an old guy too. So, like, there would be no point on making the punishment severe and the prison life, you know, harsh. It would just be cruel to do that to an old guy. I mean, to be fair, we're talking about the Romans here, and they would have been pretty cruel people in general, but I think here they decided not to be too cruel to him, to be generous with him, and allow him quite a bit of liberties, despite being under house arrest. It's kind of, I know I was rambling a bit there, but I just wanted, what I'm trying to get across is, even though it will say that Paul's a prisoner, it's not, he still has a lot of freedom. And as we read in these next chapters, he's, you know, he's spending time with Roman officials and Jewish elites as well, and still having the freedom to proclaim the gospel. And so, to do that, your prison sentence and your prison conditions must be pretty relaxed. Alright, reading chapter 25. Now 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing to ambush and kill him along the way. Festus answered, "Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there." So after spending 8 to 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened at the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, But I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I haven't done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself very well know. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving of death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them, for I appeal to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, You have appealed to Caesar you will go. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. And he said, There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute about their own religion, about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. And Festus replied, Tomorrow you will hear him. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man? The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found that he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he has made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. Alright, so that's chapter 25. Short read. Pretty straightforward. So Festus comes along. I guess I should have given a little bit of detail from last week as well, where while Paul was in prison in Caesarea, he had different Roman magistrates kind of oversee him. So the first one was a dude named Felix, and Felix was kind of scumbaggy, where Felix was kind of expecting to, like, how do I put this? Leverage bribery, you know, like your typical corrupt politician kind of, thing going on here. Felix would have tried to extort some kind of bribe. And so because of this, Felix really did nothing with Paul. He just kind of kept him around, hoping that maybe, maybe this Paul guy will whip up some sweet cash, and then I'll let him out, after he pays up. But nothing happens. So Felix kind of just does nothing. And then Festus shows up, and Festus he's kind of, from what I gather, and what the text implies, is that Festus is kind of incompetent. He's not particularly a person who knows how to make his own decisions. Of course, part of that is when you're a magistrate, like a legal magistrate like this, you always got to be careful with your moves, because, if he just lets Paul go, he's like, oh, there's nothing I can charge you with, then the Jews would obviously get pretty mad, and that would cause riots, and, various Roman leaders that we've read through the Gospels, as well as the book of Acts, they really don't want to deal with that. So they kind of don't want to just pick that approach, even though legally you could say, at least under Roman law for sure, that Paul would be innocent and that Paul could just be let go. But when in Caesarea, the Roman governors, and Festus in this case, he appears to not want to have the Jewish riots, and once again, understandable. It's trouble clearly not worth, dying over. And so the text kind of implies he's kind of not very good at his job, because he's kind of like, well, I'll just delegate this to someone else. And then tries to have Agrippa take care of the problem. And of course, once Paul appeals to Caesar, what's interesting about that is Paul forces his hand and says, all right, I appeal to Caesar, which means you must do something about me. And, I mean, in Paul's defense, Felix, kept him in prison for, 2 years, not doing a damn thing. So, it stands to reason that Paul would be like, no, you will make a decision. And so, of course, Festus could actually choose whether Paul goes to Rome or not. And he could actually make the decision pretty easily, on the grounds of, is anything that either any of the charges, which we know that Paul isn't particularly guilty of any charge, so once again, Festus could view it as this is a waste of time, let Paul go, no need to go to Rome, yada yada yada. But once again, there's the whole Jewish riot problem, and don't want to deal with that. But at the same time, you can't just send people to the emperor, not without good reasons, because then the emperor will get super pissed if you're wasting his time, and understandably so. The emperor's got a whole ass empire to deal with. You don't want to waste his time sending him some Jewish prisoner. So Festus is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, although once again he could actually get himself out of it pretty easily. But we just see that, he tries to delegate it to someone else. And so we have Agrippa show up. Now, of course, this is pretty significant, because of course, the Agrippa family has always been kind of a problem, if you will. Starting with when... You don't read this much in the Luke account, but you read this in the Matthew account of the Gospel, where after Joseph, Mary, and the young Jesus return to Judea, after being in Egypt for a few years. Oh, obligatory water noises. Give me a sec here. Okay, I think it's good enough now. Anyway, so back to the whole Festus's dilemma, if you will, of what to do with this Paul guy. Oh, sorry. I already passed that part. So I was talking about how the Agrippa family, has a little bit of contentious relationship with, well, first with Jesus, where Agrippa takes the throne after Joseph, Mary, and Jesus returned to Judea. This is the Matthew account. And Joseph was just like, I'm going to avoid Agrippa, so we're not going to stay in Judea. And so they move up to Nazareth, which would have been in Israel. And of course, that was probably because Joseph assumed that Herod Agrippa, so it's funny because we have all these Agrippas, and I'll mention a weird fact about them later. But with the Herod Agrippa in the book of Matthew, Joseph's like, I'm just going to avoid him. Don't want to have trouble. We're just going to live in Nazareth and live a peaceful life there until, eventually Jesus leaves there when he begins his ministry. So there's that Agrippa. Then we had the Herod Agrippa, a different Herod Agrippa. Yes, this gets really annoying real quick because they're all named Herod Agrippa. It's kind of, the whole lineage thing, right? So it's Herod. And so we don't know which Herod is the first. Well, there's a Herod before the first Herod mentioned in the Bible here. So I don't even know which Herod number this is, but we can assume at least +5. Let's assume that Herod the First was the one who built the second temple, and that would have been like several years prior to even when the Gospels begin. So we go through a lot of Herod Agrippas, and quite a few of them there's been problems, because there was then the Herod Agrippa in the early parts of the book of Acts, the one that had James executed and was going to have Peter executed as well, if not for the miracle prison break. And then that dude has like the whole instant death on the spot, and then like worms eat him from the inside and all weird shit like that. Yeah, the book of Acts is weird like that. So anyway, we had that Herod Agrippa, and now we have this Herod Agrippa. And it's safe to assume this guy's name's Herod Agrippa as well. They're all named Herod. Once again, it's a lineage thing. They would just name, the kings would just name their kids, basically Junior, and you are the next in line to the crown, blah, blah, blah. So there's been some contention with the Herod Agrippas. But we're going to see that in chapter 26, this one's a little different. Now, part of it may be because, his dad had like a pretty shitty way of going out. So there's that. And this Herod Agrippa probably doesn't want to have any trouble. Because, the way his dad went out. Don't want a repeat of that, and understandable. Pretty terrible way to go. So this Herod Agrippa, he'll take a very different approach, because I think what's kind of neat is he kind of gets it at this point. He's seen enough like crazy shit go down with his dad and probably his grandfather as well, and he's probably like, yeah, I don't want to have that problem. Let's not have that problem. And that's the modern person attitude. We're like, yeah, less problems in life, the better. Understandable. Okay, so I gotta explain something in the text here that's kind of, it should be obvious, but just in case you don't know. So when I made a little reference to this earlier, but basically this whole thing with Paul appealing to Caesar and what makes it such a huge deal is that appealing to Caesar was not something anyone could just do. It was a very serious call. That, let's say, typically only a Roman citizen could even make the appeal. And secondly, a Roman citizen couldn't just make an appeal to see the emperor on any given whim. He couldn't have any reason of doing it. Because once again, it's the emperor of the Roman Empire. He's got things to do, so he can't be answering all these appeals. But in Paul's case, and back with the whole Festus thing, Paul makes his appeal, and on the one hand, he forces Festus's hand. That Festus must act. He must do something about Paul's situation. He cannot do nothing like Felix did. So there's that. And then, of course, on the other hand, we have this whole thing of... Now, this is kind of assuming other parts of the text and claiming this to be the case with Paul. And so, as Paul has repeatedly mentioned, that Jesus has called them to continue spreading the gospel to Gentile areas, and Paul even has a vision about going to Rome. And so, perhaps it is more than likely the case, not just a possibility. It's more than likely the case that Paul took this as an opportunity. So he took forcing Festus's hand, and knowing, this sounds like borderline conspiracy, like Bible conspiracy, but knowing how incompetent Festus is, well, to an extent, and of course, some experiences with dealing with Felix for the last 2 years or however long it was, Paul was pretty sure that he would get his way to go see the emperor. Because when Festus appears in the picture, he doesn't appear to be able to do, he doesn't appear like he's going to do much, just like Felix did. And so when Paul makes his appeal to go to Rome, to, his appeal to Caesar, then he would force some kind of major change in Paul's life, whether if Paul would just return to Jerusalem a free man, but then of course he wouldn't live for, well, we don't know how long he'd live. He probably would be ambushed at some point or something like that. Or if the governors would actually let him go to Rome. And so, with that being said, you consider those two outcomes. This is Paul's best chance to go to Rome, and to force Festus's hand was the best way of doing it. Because once again, Festus could go the easy route and just let Paul go, but one, Festus would have a lot of trouble on his hands, dealing with Jewish riots, and of course Paul's life would be continuously in danger, because it wouldn't be easy for him to get to Rome without the free escort, which is basically what he gets later. It's kind of funny that that's how it turns out. That once again, Paul's supposed to be a prisoner, but he's given the royal treatment. He gets a whole ass escort to go with him for protection, of course, and stuff like that. It's kind of funny, actually. I find stuff like that actually pretty hilarious. But anyway, kind of going ahead there, but I just wanted to kind of paint out the kind of situation Paul ends up in by appealing to Caesar. That on the one hand, it forces the Roman governors to do something about him. He can't just stay a prisoner in Caesarea indefinitely, because that would be unjust, because he's kind of there on BS charges. So it would be wrong to leave him there. But at the same time, it's if he's granted his wish, if you will, to go to Caesar, then this is the best opportunity Paul has, the best one. And it's safe to say that it was fairly well calculated, especially after Paul had been sitting around in Caesarea for 2 years, at least. Somewhat. Something like 2 years. The Bible says 2 years, but once again, you can give or take a month or two. And so, it is, in my mind at least, I like to think that Paul very well planned this. That to have himself be granted this wish to appeal to Caesar for a legal reason. That way, one, he is also granted protection from the people trying to assassinate him. Basically, he's granted protection because he is to be tried under the Roman court under the emperor, and so this puts him as a pretty high status person. And, on the flip side, that is how you would deal with like the biggest of terrorists, which is ironic in Paul's case, I guess you could say, being a former one and all that. But it with this kind of imperial protection, not royal protection, imperial protection, it doesn't like this would be the optimal outcome for Paul. And because of how optimal it plays out, if you think about it, it gives the more reason that Paul clearly planned it to go this way, especially once Festus showed up. That he's like, this is the best opportunity and we're going to take it. Alright, so not much else to say about chapter 25. The rest of it is just Festus telling Agrippa things you already know and things we've already talked about quite a bit on this video, or not even in this video, but also like in the last few videos. Basically, the Roman governors are not sure what to do about Paul. All the stuff he's being accused of is all like Jewish religion stuff, and so it's one of those. And this is one of the, in our modern day and age, we have the equivalency of the separation of church and state. And the whole purpose of that is the state does not interfere with people's religious practices and divergences between religions. That's why in the US and in Canada, we are allowed, it's allowed that people can have different religions and stuff like that in the US and in Canada. Because the state does not infringe on the religious liberties of people. And of course, on the flip side, the agreement is that the religious communities do not infringe on the government. That they can't be like, oh, because of my religious reasons, you can't make me do X, Y, Z. That's kind of the whole point of the separation of church and state. Of course, there's that whole thing in the book of Romans that's kind of controversial, where they're like, there's the whole submit to your authorities. Of course, there are exceptions. Because, of course, in the Christian worldview, anyone who tries to make you denounce Jesus as the Christ is your enemy, basically. Because they're trying to make you commit, the greatest sin, apostasy. So that's like the exception to the rule. But for the most part, and in the modern day and age, you see this, where Christians are required to, for the most part, follow the laws and not infringe on how the state does things. But of course, the vice versa, the assumed agreement is that certain individual religious practices are to be protected, in the sense that they're not protected per se, but the state is not allowed to infringe on them. And so this is where we run into the whole thing with Paul here, and why the Roman governors kind of show no real interest. Because they're not supposed to. And it's one of those things that, like, the whole separation of church and state isn't a new idea. They've been doing this for a long time. And, in the Roman Empire, they definitely would have needed to practice. They would have needed to practice this because of, once again, how many different people groups that they have, conquered at this point. And so they would not want to piss off all their subjects. And so, understandable. So, and of course, once again, history has a funny way of playing out, that once the Romans do start infringing on other people's beliefs, and of course, there is a fair amount of historical records about the Romans doing that, especially to the Christians. That was the beginning of Rome's downfall, when they started to become tyrannical like that. Because, of course, what did the Roman people concern themselves with? Cracking down on people and their religions and trying to be, no, you must worship the same religion that we do. And then, of course, what happened was that Rome became too preoccupied with trying to control the people. But then, what happened? Barbarians from the outside come a knocking, and the Romans were, caught with their pants down. So, go figure. But basically what I'm getting at is we read here that the whole separation of church and state thing is kind of in practice here, where Festus doesn't want to impose, because he doesn't feel like he has any right to, and to be fair, he doesn't. But at the same time, he's got all these Jews a knocking, saying, do something about this Paul guy, and Festus is just like, and yes, I always have to give characters like him that funny voice, because it just works. It's kind of the picture, it's kind of how I assume he sounded. Anyway, that's all I really have to say about chapter 25. Not much. Once again, there's not really anything new in chapter 25. Once again, it's kind of summing everything up, how we got here. And so, I'm not going to repeat what I've talked about last week and the week before that. You can go watch those videos instead. Okay. Chapter 26. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today, as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews. And especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore I beg you to listen to me patiently. The Jewish people all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my very own country and also in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that I conformed to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised in our ancestors that I am on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. King Agrippa, it is because of this hope that these Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? I am too convinced that I ought to do all that is possible, I ought to do what was possible, past tense, to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priest, I put many of the Lord's people in prison. And when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme. I was so obsessed with persecuting them that I even hunted them down in foreign cities. Now on one of these journeys I was going to Damascus, with the authority and commission of the chief priest. And about noon, King Agrippa, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads." So I asked, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," the Lord replied. "Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. and I am sending you to them, to open their eyes, and turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, and so that they may receive forgiveness of sins, and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. First to those in Damascus, then those in Jerusalem, and in all of Judea, and then to the Gentiles. I preached that they should repent and turn to God, and demonstrate their repentance by their deeds. That is why some Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But God has helped me to this very day. And so, I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. That the Messiah would suffer as the first to rise from the dead. He would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You are out of your mind!" Festus shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane!" "I am not insane, most excellent Festus," Paul replied. "What I am saying is true, and it's reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Because I know you do." Then Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Paul replied, "Short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am. Well, except for these chains." The king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them. After they left the room, they began saying to one another, "This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment." And Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." And that's the end of chapter 26. Short read today. I mean, the last few chapters are pretty short, because once again, it's just wrapping everything up. And so, Paul gives his whole speech to Agrippa, and once again, a lot of it is kind of like, it's basically just a recap of the book of Acts, basically. Well, at least Paul's section of it anyway. Paul begins with his conversion story, and then he talks about how, well, I've been doing what God has called me to do. Proclaim forgiveness, that Jesus rose from the dead, and that we can be forgiven, and yada, yada, yada. You know, stuff that we have heard several times already. Of course, once again, in the context is that Paul's talking to a new person, so he would have to retell the story from the beginning. Even though, like, us as the reader, yeah, we've already read it several times, so it can get a little bit repetitive. But what is more interesting is the responses here. And so first we have Festus kind of freak out, because it's one of those things that, and it's just the matter of fact of religion, and I won't just say this exclusively to Christianity, but it's definitely true for Christians as well, is the matter of fact is, when you start talking about your religion, people will find it strange and will perceive it to be irrational and crazy. And that's kind of what Festus does. He starts saying to Paul, you know, you're insane. Your learning has made you crazy. That's a great line, by the way. I always found that line to be hilarious. He's like, your great learning has driven you mad. You know, the problem every you know, PhD student, especially the introverted ones, all, you know, they all feel this, right? They all feel that, like, people think I'm crazy because of how much I know. Paul would relate. Understandable. And, I kind of have that feeling too sometimes, like, man, like, especially if you, like, been in school for as long as I have, or, for any time longer than 5 years. I won't disclose how long I've been in school. You could probably just calculate it. But it's one of those things that, like, yeah, it is true. You spend a lot of time in school, and you do go a little cuckoo. But Paul makes the case that, like, well, that's not exactly the case. I haven't lost my mind. And it's one of those things, and we'll talk about this in the book of Romans a little bit, but I like how Paul says, well, what I'm saying is not that out there, and it's reasonable. And I like that too, because, that's one of the big arguments in the world today, and especially when you have primarily atheists do this more than other religions do. Like, you don't see a Buddhist make these claims about Christians. But, the claim that, like, well, Christianity is irrational. It's not based on anything true. But, there are thousands of documents. And, of course, one of the funny things, too, is the truth of Christianity is clearly one of the biggest questions in the world. And, there's several reasons for that. Of course, there's the whole, if Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead, then everything about the Bible is true. And, of course, I've mentioned this many times, too. The big concern that people would have is not so much the idea of believing in God. That's the easy part. The troubling part for most people, and why Christianity can be, people are not particularly fond of it, is not so much of Jesus existing and Jesus being God. Well, no, let me backtrack a bit. It's not the idea of God existing that's the problem. It's the fact that Jesus is a person as well. That he's not just God, but he's a person. And I've said this many a times on this channel, that the biggest challenge for people, and it's the daily challenge that Christians choose to face, and it's something that we all really honestly gotta deal with, is that, and that line I hate so much, that Christians use all the freaking time, is the Christianity is a relationship, not a religion. Oh, I hate that line so much. But the idea that they're getting at, even though shittily worded, the idea that they're getting at is that Jesus is a person that we can and must relate to. Of course, I'll make the bold claim, it's not just Christians relate to Jesus. Everybody must, because, of course, this is once again where the whole debate of the truth of Christianity is contested. And that it is the most contested idea in the world, because the idea of Jesus' resurrection is probably one of the most studied things in academia, period. Because we gotta have that definitive answer. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Is Jesus who he says he is? And so that's why, if you actually, go to a library, you'll actually find that, for the most part, the question of Jesus is pretty much the most published idea. That, well, let's put it this way. Of course, you may say that, like, well, no, it's not the biggest section of the library. But if you think of, like, per subject, if you will, if that makes sense. So the illustration I would use is if you have 500 books talking about, like, the species of cats. Obviously, there are way more, but we're going to use 500 as a simple number. You would have 1,000 books written about people researching Jesus Christ, the gospel stories, etc. There is just so much, work investigating who Jesus is. And so, it's interesting that Paul says here that, like, well, no, what I say here is reasonable, is because, all the claims made about Jesus, well, not all the claims, but, most of the claims made about Jesus we can trace it in academia. And that's one of the beautiful things of the 21st century. We actually have all these resources, for the most part, available to us. But, of course, back then, and this is one of the interesting things, too, that we wouldn't think they were doing this already. But it's one of those things that, like, yes, in the book of Acts, they were doing this already, was that they were making the subject of Jesus a very academic one. And part of it was so that, once again, how Christianity wanted to legitimize itself and not just be treated as like some kind of Jewish cult and some out there sect, was that they would say, no, there is actual eyewitnesses. We actually read into this. It's actually something that's researched, etc. And of course, we would have the writer here of Acts, presumably Luke. Of course he would make this claim and have Paul make this claim as well, because he himself would be a historian. And so the idea of researching and really knowing your content and studying would have been a big deal to these guys, among these academics. And so it's one of those things that, like, I don't know, I just found that really interesting that Paul's like, no, what we're thinking is not irrational. It's not that far out there. And so there's that, the TLDR is that there's that two layer. So the first one is, from an immediate context in Paul's case, is that when he's saying that, well, what we believe is rational, and it is something that you can actually research and look up, was to legitimize themselves as like, we're a real belief system and religious movement. We're not just some kind of, weird Jewish cult that's kind of out there and making stuff up. And so, for Paul to make this claim, the first reason is because, once again, the idea of Jesus and the resurrection being something that you could actually look up and have eyewitnesses as well and all that stuff, was to legitimize themselves. They're not just an out there fringe, but they're a legitimate religious movement. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is a thing that, and this is once again my complaint to Christians in general, is that the truth, like, the Bible and the gospel is something that has been researched to great length. One of the most researched topics in the world. And so we have resources to know what the Bible says, context of the Bible, etc. I mean, this is why this series exists, honestly. But you gotta do your research if you're going to talk to people about Jesus, because you don't want to look like an idiot when someone's going to make an obviously easily refutable objection of like, well, someone might have just made up the Bible. It's like, no, we have tons of resources that say this stuff is not made up. And so it's not just like, oh, the Bible stories themselves are not made up, but the idea of like, okay, believing in who Jesus is, who he says he is, and the significance of those things, of him being the Messiah and all that stuff. This is a heavily researched topic, and so you should know why these things were said and what people think about the Bible as well, from a more academic perspective, as opposed to like just taking someone's word of mouth of it. And of course, then you get to the theological aspects of, well, why should we believe? And does it make sense to believe in, Jesus and all that? Well, it does. And that's one of the things that, a lot of people try to push against that. But the fact of the matter is, it's not an irrational thing to believe in Jesus. Not at all. But of course, as I've made the claim, the issue we have in the world today is not so much the contestation of facts, but rather the implication of accepting the facts. And so, even though in the book of Acts they were worried about factual things, that like the big deal of proving that Jesus rose from the dead. In the 21st century, we're not overly concerned with that as much. I mean, minus your neo-atheist that makes a big deal out of it. Most people don't actually make a big deal out of whether that's factually true. But rather, most people are uncomfortable with the implications of accepting the reality that Jesus rose from the dead. And I've said this many times on the channel already, back to where I was earlier. The bigger problem is not so much of whether, the events of the Bible happen, and if Jesus is who he says he is. But rather, most people have a problem with being accountable to God. Being accountable to Jesus. Because that's a scary prospect, and to be fair, it is. I mean, he's a holy and perfect God, so there's that. And so, in our humanity, there's no way we could measure up. Understandable, that is a scary prospect. But at the same time, you cannot deny that, we must have that accountability with God. Of course, once again, the gospel message is that, Jesus can forgive us of our shortcomings and of our sin if we just accept his gift of forgiveness and accept his death and resurrection as the cleansing and regeneration. The cleansing of our sin and the regeneration of our lives. I tried to use fewer words and then realized, wait, it's not going to make sense if I just slew it all together. But anyway. But many people don't want to change that. They don't want to move away from their sin. That's why, hot take, but that's why a lot of things that we would have viewed as sin, people are trying to say, no, it's not sin. And let's just not say it's not sin, but let's make it sanctioned. Not just legal, but sanction it as a sacred right. These things that the Bible would say is sin, because it's trying to reject not so much God's existence, but more importantly, I mean, I know it sounds weird to say this, but it's not his existence that people have. It's not his existence people really want to challenge, because once again, you can't really challenge God's existence. But it's more his authority that is being challenged. Because of course, ultimately, people want to be their own gods. That's the fundamental reason. And so, I know I'm going on a sidetrack here, because once again, the whole politics about Christianity being rational. But what I am trying to cover my bases with is also, the problem isn't Christianity being rational or irrational. And it's actually pretty hard to refute the rationality of Christianity and its theology and its philosophy. That's not the part that's not the contended issue with most people you'll encounter. But rather, most people would reject the authority of Christ, which is actually a more important aspect than dealing with God's existence. I know that's a weird thing to say, because you could make the claim of well, if we don't affirm God's existence, then what's the point of affirming his authority? But at the same time, once again, the existence thing isn't a big deal, because once again, if you read parts in the Old Testament, and there's funny parts, the book of Daniel does this for sure, where Daniel will use parallels with will parallel God with ancient semi-pagan traditions. And the reason why Daniel would do that was he was making the point of the belief in God is not the weird part. It's the accountability to God and the humanity of God. That's the weird part to people. Which now brings us back to the book of Acts. It's not so much the existence of God that's the weird part. It's this accountability to Jesus Christ. That's the challenge for people. And we see that in both Festus. Well, Festus is more like a, non-believer having an outburst. And then we even see it with Agrippa. And Agrippa's objection is kind of interesting, where he's just and to be fair, Agrippa was, he was very stern in his objection, because Paul was kind of goading him. And, you know, Paul being this, you know, the sly guy that he is. And this backs up, you know, Paul being really sly here, I think backs up my whole, like, not really a controversy, but the whole thing about, like, Paul planning out a lot of this stuff. It's pretty clear Paul planned stuff, like, you know, him going to Rome and all that. It was clearly planned. But to be fair, Paul did have, like, 2 years to plan this out. like an evil mastermind. But when Agrippa, you know, hears Paul talk about the gospel, and then Paul goads him a little bit, where he's just saying, like, well, you believe in the prophets, right? And then Agrippa's just like, oh, no, I'm not going to get caught that easily. You're not going to get me there, buddy. And so I love the line where Agrippa's just like, you think it's such a short time, you're going to convert me to be a Christian? Of course, we're going to dissect this line a little bit more. But I love how, like, once again, the objection is not so much that, like, and, you know, I'm going to give this word of solace to, you know, my fellow believers watching this. When one thing that you really need to get really good at articulating, you don't need to worry too much about people, like, trying to quote-unquote prove God's existence. Not that you could prove that, because, you know, God reveals himself, so there's no point of, like, trying to prove him. God can prove himself, basically, in his revealing himself. But the thing that when you have your apologetic, you know, discussions with your non-believer friends, the thing you really need to get at the core at is, why do people feel the need to challenge Jesus' authority? I think that's the bigger issue at hand. And I mean, if you look at society as a whole, that's essentially what it's about. Because that's essentially what a lot of quote-unquote secularization of culture is fundamentally about. The idea of challenging the authority of God. Because, as I mentioned earlier, a big way that this happens, especially we see it, and this is where many people make that claim. This is also an incorrect claim, I think. And I really dislike it when there's, like, those Bible preachers on YouTube that make this claim as well. It's not true. I understand why they would think this, but it's not actually true. Where some people will make the claim that, like, oh, there's more sin in the world today. Well, like, I guess it's partly true because there's more people to commit sin, so therefore there is more sin. 8 billion people in the world today is a lot more than several. You know, we're at, like, 6 billion years, like 2 decades ago. We jumped up like 2 billion people. So I guess when there's 2 more billion people in the last few decades, okay, there's more sin because there's more people committing it. But I'm against the idea of when people say, like, oh, like, people are being more sinful. That's not necessarily true. The way that I would look at it is, people are more upfront about it and belligerent about being called out on it. Because, of course, in them olden days, if people were committing sin, you would get struck down pretty quickly. You would be called out for it. You would be punished for it. And then you would be, you know, you would, in a way, be set up correctionally to stop doing it, or decrease it at the very least. But the world's different today, where that's not what happens when people are out there committing sin. In some cases, it's celebrated. No, that's the extreme case, that it's celebrated. But the first one is that excuses are easily made. So, you know, hot topic. Mega hot takes here. But, I mean, to be fair, I'm done the reading section of the Bible, and I've only been streaming for an hour, so I can ramble for a little bit. First mega hot take of the week. But you think of, like, these shootings that are going on. You know, and apparently there's been a lot more gun violence as of late. A lot of people, a lot of guys that do this, they've justified why they have to go out and, and shoot people. And it's because they've made enough excuses for themselves that they are in the right to do it. Even though we know, and we don't need the law to tell us this, because it's one of those, like, assuming you're not completely batshit, crazy and sociopath, and, like, not just, like, minorly sociopathic, like, straight up, you had to be straight up, like, the Joker level to not think this, but we know that it's wrong to go and just hurt people. Intrinsically, we do know this. And this is where, once again, there's that whole thing of, like, this is where some people made the claim that we don't need God to tell us morality. And they kind of resort to using this argument like people inherently know stuff. But, of course, the biblical argument is that, well, that's because God indwelt us with that. And that's part of the whole being made in God's image kind of thing. That we are more like God than we think we are. In that God has implanted into us, if you will, some sense of morality. And so you don't need a special revelation every single time to know what's right or wrong. that God trusts us enough to know this and how to carry it out on an individual level. And because of this, that's why we know that, like, okay, going out and gunning people down is clearly wrong. But in the world that we live in today, people are so quick to make excuses of, like, violence. And, I use the shooting, like, gun violence and shooters as an extreme example. But, these people don't just, like, wake up magically one morning and go, hey, I'm going to go shoot people up and I feel totally justified in doing so. That doesn't happen. You read a lot of these guys' very sad stories about how shitty their lives were that led to that point. But it's a two-way street. Because think about all the things that were, all the wrongs that happened to them was people committing sin and thinking it was okay. And then it just builds up, and then these guys that think themselves as the victim. Of course, ultimately at the end of the day, you still have to make your own decisions, and you can't just let other people's circumstances cause you to be a messed up person. That at the end of the day. But when you hear these guys' stories about how terrible their home life was, being school dropouts, being incels and stuff like that, that is other people committing sin against them, and then that gets pented up, and then of course the unfortunate reality is that the gospel has not reached out to them, because many are Christians. We're sucking at our jobs here and reaching out to people, but of course these guys are kind of tough to reach at times because they've been hurt by sin so much from other people that the last thing they want to hear is the gospel message, unfortunately. But that's all the more reason that we got to be proactive in having Christ change all of us and proclaiming that that's why we all need the gospel. It can't be like, oh, it's okay for some of us not to believe and some of us can't believe it makes you feel good. No. The gospel is supposed to give life to all of us. And if there's that little bit of rot, if there's as that old saying, it just takes a little bit of rot to kill a whole tree, kind of thing. And the tree can be figurative of society. But you think of people that commit violence, and gun violence is the extreme, but a lot of men that abuse women, that's a sin. But so many people make excuses for stuff like that. And of course now the tables have turned because feminism. The tables have turned, and now a lot of women abuse men. And that's a sin too. But instead of saying, oh shit, it's wrong to abuse people, that would be the rational thing to think, which is ironic, right? The rational thing is to think that maybe I shouldn't go around abusing people because, every religion's got this part right. treat others how you would want to be treated. That's why it's called the golden rule. But instead, what do you see? And this is where like why nobody trusts feminism is because all they do is make excuses for this kind of shit, right? That's all they do is make excuses. And see, that's the difference. It's when people committed sin, it's not, oh, correct them and punish if you have to. It's you start by making excuses, and then after you make excuses, then people start making justifications for committing sin. And then it's not just making justifications because that's not good enough. You have to make it appear as if it's good. And then you can't just make it like good, and you do that by making it legal. But just because something is legal doesn't mean it's good. But this is kind of the transient of logic and the natural progression of how, even though this is me challenging that whole there's more sin today than there was like 50 years ago, or whatever nonsense claims people make. It's not so much of the sin themselves. People still, like, once again, people in the ancient world, men abused women and women abused men. But that didn't change. There may be more people doing it, but that particular sin element didn't change. And it didn't like increase in its level. I mean, I guess to an extent it did. Because once again, that just happens when you have more people. But the problem we face in our society is more about people, this progression of starting with making excuses, and then people start making, with those excuses, they justify themselves and saying, well, it's okay for me to commit this sin. I'm justified in doing this. And then it's not just, but for some people that's not good enough. It can't be just like, well, I can't, people will view me as like, a weenie dog douchebaggy if I just claim it to always be like excuses to justify my sin. So we have to make it like, we have to have people view it as a good thing that I commit these sins. And then usually people make that happen by making it legal. That's usually the easy way of doing that step. But then for some people, and this is where you get your crazies, and then this is why everybody thinks society is crazy. But it's, you don't just go from, you try to make something that's bad or something that is sin to try and make it good. But then people take it to the next level and then they celebrate it. Like, oh, it's not only like good that I'm doing this, but you should be happy that I'm committing evil. Which sounds insane, but to be fair, unfortunately, we see this kind of stuff happen in the world today. I'm not going to say on certain details. I'm not going to get thrown off the internet. I'm not going to make it that easy for you. But you know exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, we could just pick some easy examples of, your socialist and communist dictators. Right? They commit mass murder. And yet, but because of the ideologies that they shield themselves with, that people have claimed to be good, then when these guys, these leaders of those ideas, they commit something like mass murder, your Joseph Lenins, your Castros, those people, and they're just committing mass murder. And that's where, you gotta think, like, millions of people have died in the 20th century to these people. But a lot of people tend to view those things as good because people have allowed sin to be viewed as good. And then when these monsters commit these atrocities, then people who've deluded themselves into thinking that sin is good would naturally follow these people and celebrate the evil they've committed. And so that's one of the things that, like, now I know that I went on the deep end real quick, but once again, the best way to paint illustrations is going on the deep end. But This kind of stuff doesn't just magically appear, okay? Hitler didn't kill 6 million people, boom, overnight like that. It didn't happen like that, okay? But it happened because of little increments of rejecting, little rejection of Jesus here, a little rejection of Jesus there, and then continue rejecting Jesus. Well, I can't just reject Jesus, who's semi-abstractal. I have to reject his followers, the Christians, too, and hate on these people. And not just hate on these people, but call their ideas stupid. You know, this gospel thing. And then you have to start convincing yourself that that's a stupid thing. And then, well, to truly prove it's stupid, I'm going to do everything opposite of what it says. So when Jesus says, love your enemies, well, no, we're gonna kill them. We're gonna kill them by the gallows, by the hundreds of thousands. Because that sounds like a great idea. Not loving your enemies. How about give to the poor? No. We're going to cripple the poor, and then tax all the working people, and then make the poor people blame other people, not care for the poor, and make other people not care for the poor, and then make the poor resentful, and then we can weaponize them. That kind of thing. That sounds like a great idea. And it starts with little things like that at a time. It doesn't just happen overnight. That, what many of these Christians claim of like, oh, there's more sin in the world today. It didn't happen like that. It's not. But rather, it was a reversal of godly wisdom. And that's where, once again, the book of Proverbs, how does the book of Proverbs begin? Wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. But as we see, there is no wisdom because there's too much rejection of God and his message and his spirit as well. And that's a good contender for, or the surface level of what Jesus defines as the greatest sin, blaspheming the Holy Spirit. There's no wisdom. Wisdom begins with the fear of God, but we now live in a society that says, no, we want to reject that idea and be our own gods. But of course, mega hot take, but not really a hot take if anyone actually reads their Bibles. But the 10 Commandments, even the commandments about like not worshiping idols, has nothing to do with what people can do for God, but has everything to do with how people should treat other people. And so, that command about do not make idols for yourselves and only worship the Lord your God. Yeah, we see the consequences of that. All the people who worship themselves were the people who committed the biggest atrocities, which is a lot of people. And, even on a smaller scale, you may think that, like, well, I may not be a Joseph Stalin, but you think of these guys, we talk about, like, domestic abuse. Well, that's a sin. Why do you think that comes about? More often than not, it's the rejection of the rejection of God and the rejection of his wisdom. And that's the thing that, as we read through the book of Acts, and I'm trying to bring it back here to wrap it up here, and then I can kind of do more rambling after. But, and especially, you have questions as well, definitely shoot them, because I need something more to talk about than, well, what I'm talking about now. But as Paul is like, hey, I'm just here to share that we can have forgiveness and this new life with Jesus. That's all I'm here to talk about. It's funny that, like, these higher, these authority figures, they're like, they quickly push back. In the case, in this case here in chapter 26, well, of course, these guys are more than likely guys who worship themselves more than they worship God. They are men of authority, so it's usually people in authority tend to be corrupted by that power. That's just kind of how it be. It's just a sad reality. Power corrupts. But what I'm trying to get at is this is something that all of us must deal with ourselves, even if we're not the most powerful of people. In our daily life, we must acknowledge that, well, we need to be forgiven of our sins, and for Jesus to empower us to move a life beyond sin. Well, I guess I should dissect these last few parts of Acts 26, because there's actually this one line that I think is pretty interesting when Herod gives his objection when Paul's like goading him. Do you believe in the prophets, Agrippa? And he says, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? Now, the wording here is very interesting, because for him to refer to the believers of the way as Christians, it really shows how much of the Christian movement has influenced culture. That one, they actually, these believers of the way actually have a name now. And sure, we read like quite a few chapters ago that like in Antioch, the word Christian was kind of being used, but it was kind of thrown as like an insult and making fun of these like believers of the way. But here it's like an actual thing. And I'm pretty sure this is the only time that it's actually treated this way, that like being called a Christian was not just like some kind of Greeks throwing a little insult, but it's an actual thing. Christianity is a thing, and it's official. It's official now. And so for Herod to acknowledge it, well, Agrippa, this Agrippa, I know it gets confusing because they're all named Herod Agrippa, but Agrippa here, he acknowledges that, and it confirms. You could read something like Josephus of how Christianity did actually become like a thing. Definitely by the time Josephus was writing, of course, Christianity was just like a label. It wasn't like, it was an official label at that point. It wasn't just like some offhanded word that like only people in Antioch used, but it was an actual term to refer to these people who believed in the resurrection of Jesus. And that's kind of an interesting thing that like, yeah, Christianity in chapter 26 had achieved its goal, that it was a real movement, and it had stretched great influence. Though the job isn't done yet, they haven't gone to all corners of the world, if you will. But Christianity is going to the nations, as God has always intended the Jews to bring the word of God to people. And now that Jesus, rose from the dead, that word is completed. And now the believers are confident in sharing that word. And, there's that whole thing, and maybe I'll talk about this another day too, but there's one of those interesting things where if you actually read the Old Testament has this whole, God mandates to the Jews to basically do what Jesus tells the Christians much later, but not to make excuses, but perhaps the Jews didn't do it was because they felt ill-equipped. And to be fair, there was no way of actually having the forgiveness of sin, the message of the forgiveness of sins, be complete without a full sacrifice from God. Which, once again, if you want to go in great detail on this, that's what the book of Hebrews is basically about. But as we read at the end of Acts, and Agrippa's affirmation, I guess you could say, of Christian being a term to refer to a group of people, it's like, yeah, it's official. And I think that's interesting because, as we read through the book of Acts, what was interesting was they were never, for the most part, minus, some punks in Antioch, the believers are always called like followers of the way. And so it's kind of like given this weird, like mystical, mysterious kind of title, because they're they were treated like, well, we're not sure what to think of you. But here it's like, no, it's pretty solid now. We're Christians. That's a thing. I think that's actually what makes the statement here actually interesting when you actually look at it. And it's actually the first time that it's used outside of Antioch and in an official kind of circumstance of like, yes, you can be labeled as a Christian. It's actually an identity. I found that kind of neat. Just a little poke here in verse 29. Paul has a little bit of a laugh. And it's one of those things that, like, once again, the Bible writer's just having a good time. And it's one of those things that, like, yeah, I know we're talking about serious stuff here, but the Bible knows how to have a good laugh here and there. And Paul has this whole, like, well, I wish everybody was like me, except for the chains. And, just kind of Christians having a good laugh. And be a naysay to all those people that say like Christianity is not about having fun. Wrong. You read in the Bible, Christians have like tons of fun. They know how to laugh at themselves, and I think that's one of the ironic things too. And because there's a loss of fear of God, people don't know how to laugh at themselves anymore. Everybody takes everything too seriously. It's ironic, right? The fear of God can enable you to laugh at yourself and have a good time. Contrary to popular belief of, oh no, Christianity is going to suck the fun out of my life. It's like, dude, look at all these people that take themselves way too seriously. You just gotta learn to laugh at yourself and have a good time. And Paul knows how to have a good time. He just like cracks a little joke after giving this serious speech about the gospel. Like, come on, like, I mean, I like to think I model that, but of course my sense of humor is kind of dry, so I'm not very good at it, as you can tell. But oh no, introvert problems. But I think what's great here is that Paul can have a little bit of a laugh, at this very serious time, and when he's supposed to be serious and give people the gospel. Then chapter 26 ends with Festus, or Agrippa, saying to Festus what we all knew already. Yeah, not a big deal. Too bad that Paul appealed to Caesar, because otherwise we could have just let him go. Something that we all already knew, but it just had to be said in text just in case you didn't quite figure that out. But once again, this goes back to the whole, like, Paul kind of planned it, that he was going to go to Rome, and by appealing to Caesar, he basically ensured his way of doing that. Because Agrippa just tells Festus, like, yeah, all the stuff that Paul charged was not a big deal. We could have let him go. But we'll see. We'll see if, what happens to Paul next. As we have 2 more chapters, which we will finish next week. And we'll read the conclusion of the book of Acts and the end of Paul's journey here. Anyway, that's all I have to say about these 2 chapters. I did have that whole rant thing to like extend this video, because otherwise this video would be pretty short. But with all that being said, this is all we're going to be reading for today. Just some housekeeping, because starting next week we do have big changes on this channel. So first, it's here. I'm super looking forward to it. I'm going to be doing Xenoblade Chronicles 3 on the channel. Been a while since I've done games on this channel, so I'm happy to get back into it and have a grand old time with the game I've been looking forward to. I say that about every game I played on this channel for the most part, but Xenoblade Chronicles 3, it's going to be a banger. So I hope you guys will come, hang out, enjoy the experience with me. And I'll have a co-host in those videos with my buddy Shining Light. And that will be on Monday. We'll start Monday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. So this coming Monday, that will be August 1st, we will begin our Xenoblade Chronicles 3 streaming Let's Play. So that's going to be a grand old time. I hope you guys will definitely come out for that. And that will be at 2 o'clock Pacific time. Since I also plan to do Xenoblade on Wednesdays, we will move the Bible studies back to Fridays. And the Bible studies, well, next week we'll do the Book of Acts. And then we'll take a couple weeks for a break, and then we'll do the Book of Romans. But they will be on Fridays from 3 o'clock Pacific time to like 5:30 or whatever, when I normally finish. Well, the way I'm going to approach the Book of Romans will be different, so the streams won't be as long. But even then, it'll be like 3 o'clock to like 4:35. So it'll still be like an hour and a half. Kind of like today's stream. Of course, today it has to be a little bit shorter because I'm expected somewhere like 5:30. So we can have like a super long stream today. But today was also a lot shorter than I thought it'd be. I thought I'd be finished like 5, not 4:30. So, but next Friday we will finish the Book of Acts. So it'll be a week and a bit before we actually finish it. But just how it be. So those are the two major things on this channel. So just a quick recap: Xenoblade Chronicles starting August 1st, 2 p.m. And then Bible reading will be put back on Fridays. And they will be at 3 o'clock Pacific time. So that's basically it for announcements. Big things though. And the channel will be more active again. I know I haven't been very active for the last little while. But July has just been full of all kinds of things. So it was nice to take a little bit of a break, let's just say that. And to not do too much. So, but you know, starting August we'll be back into the groove of things, and we'll be doing, you know, game streams again and readings on Friday. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed reading through the Book of Acts with me. I encourage you guys to read it again, and as well as just read the entirety of the Book of Acts yourself. It's a great read. And with that said, I hope to see you guys next week. Hope to see you guys on Monday for Xenoblade Chronicles, because that's gonna be a hoot and a half. So, yeah. Have a great rest of your day. See you guys next week, and God bless you.